All right. So thank you everyone again for joining us. I would like now to introduce our guest speakers for today. We have Dr. Amy Goodbrand. Amy is a hydrologist with over a decade of research and consulting experience in mountain, boreal, and prairie landscapes that is used to support science-based decision-making and provide expert professional advice in watershed management. She combines her extensive field-based process knowledge with hydrological modeling to improve our understanding kind of lost it here, to improve our understanding of how land use, natural disturbances, and climate affect our water sources to ensure water security and forest integrity into the future. We also have Dr. Ryan Mcdonald joining us today. He's a hydrologist specializing in process-based hydrology and the interactions between water resource and aquatic ecosystems. He uses this core knowledge to address complex issues at the intersection of human land use, climate, and the natural environment. This background enables him to pursue research questions that can be applied in a practical management context and provide guidance to federal, provincial, and First Nation governments. Without further ado, I would like to pass this over to Dr. Amy Goodbrand.
Great, thanks. I'm just having a bit of technical difficulty. How do I go into presenter view, Cindy or Alyssa?
If you click back.
It's not letting me.
I'm wondering if it's not letting you change the slide because we have the little pointer. Is it through PowerPoint or is it through Google Slides?
It's through PowerPoint.
You should be able to use the left and right arrows on your keyboard to advance as well. Or the space bar.
Okay, oh my gosh, sorry about that, everybody. We had tried that prior to the meeting. So here we go. Okay, so good morning, everyone in the Zoom room, and thank you, Cindy, for the introduction. MacDonald Hydrology was asked to share our knowledge on the wet part of the wetlands for this speaker series. MacHydro is specialized, it's a specialized small consulting company based out of Cranbrook, BC, that focuses on hydrologic modeling and assessment, as well as research to evaluate water management, land use, and climate change. So over the years, I've shared with my colleague, Ryan, who is also in the room, about my fond memories of working in wetlands, from prairie potholes to boreal plain fens to even Argentinian bogs. So for that reason, Ryan let me take the lead, and I get to share my wetland hydrology knowledge with you today. So I've learned that nothing about wetlands makes sense except in the light of hydrology. And I've spent many, many hours mucking about in wetlands. But you know, I've yet to find leak-proof waders and a foolproof way to evade those terrible black flies and mosquitoes. So I'm really happy to trade a day mucking about in wetlands for some time with you all on Zoom. I'm going to start this talk by first explaining what makes a wetland. But before I talk about how wetlands may be vulnerable to climate change, we need to talk about how hydrologic processes, watershed, and wetland budgets. So this will provide a basis for understanding how different wetland types function, and as a result, help to predict the effects of natural or human-induced hydrologic changes on wetlands like land use disturbance and climate change. So wetlands, estuaries, intertidal, and flood ecosystems all really occupy the transition zone between predominantly wet and dry environments. So wetlands are areas where soils are water saturated for a sufficient length of time, whereas terrestrial ecosystems occur where water is not really in surplus. The associated flood ecosystems are sites that are flooded for a short time during the growing season, when those water bodies periodically flood their banks, depositing or eroding, fluvial or glacial estuarine materials. And estuarine ecosystems have a freshwater source in a marine environment. So therefore, each of these ecosystems have distinct ecological functions, habitat values, and sensitivities. So today, I'm just going to be focusing on the ones outlined in the red. There are three attributes that define a wetland. The first is the proximity of water level relative to the ground surface, meaning soils are water saturated for a sufficient length of time. And this excess water at low oxygen levels really determines the soil development. So wetlands have hydric soils with either surface peat or a glade mineral horizon within 30 centimeters of the soil surface. And peatland formation usually occurs in cool climates where water inputs exceed those evapotranspiration rates. And lastly, wetlands must have hydrophytic plants, which just means that these plants normally grow in soils that are water saturated for the major portion of the growing season. The three attributes that define a wetland interact with each other. So the hydrology of a wetland really modifies and determines the physical environment of the wetland, whereas the shallow hydrologic environment of wetlands creates unique biogeochemical conditions that distinguish it from aquatic and terrestrial environments. So as a result, changes to the biological community like vegetation or microbes and the available oxygen result in these positive and negative feedbacks within the wetland that are either directly or indirectly linked to the water level depth. So for example, a wetland with standing water will create a condition of oxygen deficiency in wetland soils. And so then these anaerobic conditions develop more quickly in saturated soil than in unsaturated soil due to low oxygen diffusion. But anaerobic conditions in wetland soils also affect vegetation by creating adverse conditions for root survival and growth. Thus, the presence of water substantially affects soil oxygen concentration, which then affects what plants can grow there and survive. And as we all know, beavers also play a large role on the landscape and the hydrologic function of wetlands. So when a beaver moves into an area and builds a dam on a flowing stream, that will increase the water level and create a more standing water body or slower moving water body. And it results in conditions with a similar feedback loop to the one I mentioned in the slide before. So you get more anaerobic conditions and it becomes more stress for different plants to grow and survive. So why do we all care about wetlands? Well, every person lives in a watershed, and many of these watersheds have wetlands that provide wildlife habitat and plant diversity. They store carbon, they support, with respect to hydrology, the function of the water cycle like water storage or groundwater recharge. But people are really changing the water cycle in their watersheds through land use disturbance and climate change. And if wetlands are lost or degraded, then the watersheds will poorly function with problems around too little, too much, or too polluted water. So therefore, we really need to conserve and enhance and restore the hydrologic function of wetlands for these watersheds. Wetlands are significant in altering the water cycle of a watershed, and in British Columbia, wetlands make up 3% of BC's land base. Now, although this might not sound like a lot, 75% of the terrain in Northeast BC are wetlands. And there are several important large wetland complexes of open water and vegetation across the province. And these include like the Upper Columbia Wetland Complex, the Crescent Valley wetlands that have seen extensive loss in the last 100 years, as you can see from the photo at the bottom of the screen. As well, the Fraser River Delta and estuaries that have been estimated to have lost 80% of its wetland habitat, mostly due to agriculture. So for this reason, we need to understand the hydrologic effects of land use disturbance and climate change on wetlands by detecting, understanding, and predicting changes in the water cycle at various space and time scales. So nothing makes sense in hydrology except in the light of that water cycle. So hydrologic processes that occur within a watershed are the same processes that occur within a wetland. So the major components are precipitation, evaporation from the soil, water body surfaces, and intercepted precipitation that evaporates or sublimates off of vegetation. So any excess water that doesn't evapotranspirate will fall to the ground, and it will either run off the surface or it'll infiltrate into the soil. But before it reaches the water table, which is noted by that blue dashed line, it must percolate through the unsaturated soil where it can either be stored or recharge the groundwater. So the formation, the persistence, the size, and the function of wetlands are really controlled by hydrologic processes. But the distribution and differences in wetland type, the vegetation, composition, and the soils that grow in them are caused primarily by climate and geology and the topography. So really the geomorphic setting, which will influence the source and flow path of water to the wetlands and the movement of water through or within the wetland and its water quality. So therefore, the relative importance of each of the components of the water cycle differs from wetland to wetland, and understanding the sources of water to the wetland provide a basis for understanding the hydrologic function, or the role the wetland plays in changing the quantity and quality of water that's moving through them. And in turn, it really helps to predict the effects of natural and human-induced hydrologic changes. So I'm going to discuss the three major components of water source to the wetlands: precipitation, surface runoff, and channelized inflow and groundwater. So precipitation is really any form of water, such as rain, snow, sleet, hail, that falls from the atmosphere and reaches the ground. And precipitation provides water for wetlands both directly and indirectly. So obviously any water provided to the wetland directly when it falls on the surface, but also indirectly when precipitation falls outside the wetland and then is transported to the wetland by surface or groundwater flow. So hydrologists measure, for example, the snowpack across the watershed, because snow that falls in the watershed provides surface flow to wetlands during snowmelt. But snowmelt may also recharge the groundwater, and groundwater may sustain flow to wetlands during the summer and fall, which we call base flow. So hydrologists are really also concerned with not only how much precipitation falls, but how long it falls for and how often it falls and where it falls, if it's at high elevation or is it falling at low elevation, and what time of year, because the source of water to wetlands will differ. So for example, if it rains during the peak of the growing season and water levels are really low versus if it rains after the snow melt when the watershed and the soils are really, really wet. The amount of precipitation that provides water to the wetlands is also influenced by how much water is intercepted by the vegetation. So this will eventually evaporate or sublimate to the atmosphere. So hydrologists are interested in what we call net precipitation, or the amount of water that falls through the vegetation, which is termed throughfall, and the amount that flows down the branches and the trunks of trees of the vegetation or other vegetation, and that's called stem flow. And so intercepted water can become a very major component of a wetland water budget, especially if it's forested. So, up to or anywhere more than 30% of rainfall can be intercepted by forested wetlands. So hydrologists really use stem flow and throughfall gauges in the growing season to measure these individual components of the water budget. Surface water inflow is supplied to the wetland through channelized stream flow, flooding from lakes and rivers, overland surface runoff, or groundwater that's discharging onto the surface, and even tides. But the amount and duration of inflow will typically vary seasonally because some sources of water, like rainfall and snowmelt, are less constant than, say, groundwater inflow to streams, so the base flow. And it is a critical component for distinguishing between sort of 3 different types of stream channels. So the perennial stream that have flow present year-round. Intermittent streams receive groundwater, but only for part of the year. So say 5 to 9 months, when the water table really intersects the channel bed. So when the water table is always below the stream bed, then groundwater never contributes to stream flow. And so as a result, these ephemeral channels are really only provide surface water to wetlands during large rainstorms or during the snowmelt period. Groundwater then originates as precipitation or as recharge from surface water bodies. And precipitation, or water that seeps from rivers and wetlands, moves slowly downward through the unsaturated zone and goes towards the water table. So the top of the saturated zone is the water table. And groundwater in the saturated zone flows through aquifers or aquifer systems, but the rate of flow is dependent on whether the material is permeable, like a sandstone, which is where you would normally drill a drinking water well into, or less permeable, like a granitic bedrock. So groundwater moves in response to hydraulic head, moving from a location of high hydraulic head to one of low pressure. So this is called your hydraulic gradient. And groundwater can also flow in shallow local aquifer systems where water is near the land surface, or in deeper intermediate regional aquifer systems. So hydrologists need to monitor groundwater flow, which can be accomplished by placing an array of piezometers within wetlands or watersheds. And these are just small diameter perforated tubes that we would install at specified soil depths. So piezometers help us determine whether water moves to or from a wetland. And so there's different wetlands depending on how the groundwater flows. So water that moves from a wetland toward the water table would be a groundwater recharge wetland. So in this case, the water table is lower in the surrounding landscape than in the wetland. However, wetlands are commonly in groundwater discharge areas, or when groundwater flows into the wetland. So in this case, the water table is higher in the surrounding landscape. And so with fluctuating water tables throughout the year, a wetland can shift back between a groundwater inflow and a groundwater recharge wetland. Water can also move through a wetland at the surface of the exposed water table, and we refer to this as a groundwater flow through wetland. So flow through wetlands are often connected with outflows of one being the inflow of the next in a sort of fill and spillover system, where water supply to the lower wetland is often delayed until the upper one starts to fill up. And lastly, perched wetlands occur when water within the wetland is disconnected or perched above the groundwater. So lower permeable soils, like clay that only allows water to percolate very, very slowly, reduces water movement between the wetland and the water table. So as a result, these wetlands are more vulnerable to drying out because groundwater can't supply a more constant source of water, especially in the summer season. So as I mentioned before, the time of year can really influence whether a wetland recharges groundwater or is a location of groundwater inflow. So water levels in the wetlands are typically higher in the spring after snowmelt and when we have those early spring rains before high ET rates of the summer. And the higher water table would result in recharge to the groundwater. But the water level recedes due to water losses through the summer and the high evapotranspiration rates. And so as a result, groundwater inflow sustains the wetland water level during this period. Groundwater recharge or inflow into wetlands is also affected by its landscape position, the soil characteristics, and the geology of the watershed. So wetlands typically occur at a break and slope where the water table intersects the ground surface. And this creates sort of a constant groundwater seep that maintains soil saturation. While at lower topographic locations, wetlands may form in a depression at a location where groundwater may discharge into the wetland. But the geology of a watershed can also be really important. So for example, where stratigraphic changes occur near the land surface. So we have layering of, glacial till and sand and gravel. So the glacial till is less permeable, so water has a harder time moving through it. And the sand and gravel is more permeable, meaning groundwater more easily moves through it. So as the water percolates down into the soils, it will interact at that till sand interface and move towards the land surface where it intersects. And this is a great condition for where fens might develop. Other low permeable units like permafrost, which is a soil material with a temperature below zero for more than a year, results in extremely slow water movement. And so in areas where permafrost is continuous, the frozen soils cause water to stand in the surface depressions. And in discontinuous permafrost zones, the presence or absence of permafrost will influence the location and the distribution of wetlands. And these areas do occur in British Columbia, as we can see here from the map. So the water movement through and within wetlands are influenced, as I mentioned before, by the depth to the water table, and the hydrologic gradient. So that's the movement of water from a high hydraulic head to one of a low hydraulic head. And hydraulic gradients will vary depending on the type of landscape. So for example, in a mountain valley, there's a large range in elevation. So as a result, water is going to move a lot faster than if we were on sort of a hummocky terrain, which is sort of classic of a boreal plain, or in sort of a floodplain area of a river valley. And so the differences in landscape will determine the connectivity of wetlands to groundwater. So whether there is these really deep regional groundwater flow systems or more local groundwater flow. And the landscape will also really dictate the connectivity of how wetlands connect to the downstream network. So this will influence how much, how long, and really how frequent water will move through and within the wetlands. There can also exist large variability in the hydrologic connectivity of a watershed and the wetlands within that watershed, which result in sort of this variable runoff response to a given rainfall event. So I'm sure we've all seen this on the landscape. We talk about wet years and dry years and flooding events. So for example, in all three of these scenarios, the watersheds receive an average rainfall. But based on the antecedent moisture conditions in the watershed, so if we have a drier watershed or lower antecedent conditions where the water levels in the wetlands are really low and there's a lot of available room for that rainfall, we won't have a very large runoff event. But if the watershed is really wet, or we've had a lot of years of a lot of wetting up and rainfall, then there's not going to be a lot of room in those wetlands. The water levels are going to be really high. And then we get this average rainfall that falls on the landscape. And because the soils are so saturated and there's not a lot of storage, we will have a really large runoff event, which could produce a flooding event. So water levels and the amount of water already in the watershed must be considered at both the wetland and the watershed scale. And we have to look at that over time so that we can adequately understand the hydrologic function of the wetland within these watersheds. So water budgets in the context of geology and landscape position provide a basis for understanding hydrologic processes of a wetland. And the wetland water budget is the total of the inflows and the outflows of water from a wetland. And this will dictate the water level in the wetland and how much the wetland can store, so the amount of volume it can store. So the relative importance of each component in maintaining wetlands varies both over space and time, but all these components will interact to create the hydrology of each individual wetland. So as a result, the relative importance of each component of the water cycle differs from wetland to wetland and provides the basis for understanding its hydrologic function and predicting the effects of natural and human-caused hydrologic changes. Determining water budgets for wetlands is imprecise because as the climate varies from year to year, so does the water balance. So the accuracy of individual components depends on how well they can be measured and the magnitude of the associated errors. A wetland water budget is typically a volumetric calculation over time. So we want to account for the amount of surface area that precipitation will directly contribute to a wetland, or water that will evaporate from the entire surface area of the wetland. Wetland storage is a measure of the water level in the wetland. Hydrologists measure this water level using an automated logger in a stilling well that records a continuous water level over time. So the higher water level, the less storage capacity in the wetlands. And some wetlands have continuously high water levels, but generally the water level fluctuates seasonally in response to events. So this is a wetland hydrograph, and the water level is shown in blue. And as you can see, when we get that snowmelt pulse, the water level in the wetland reaches its maximum annual peak. And then as evapotranspiration really kicks in the summertime, we start to see a recession of the hydrograph. But then we can also see some increases because of maybe a larger rain event. And so when the water level is really high and there's no storage left in the wetland, any additional water that enters the wetland will run off rapidly to downstream water. So as I showed in the previous wetland hydrograph, the loss of water to the atmosphere is an important component of the wetland water budget and can really drive that water level recession. So water is removed by evaporation from soil or surfaces of the wetland, and by transpiration by plants through their leaf stomates. So the combination of evaporation and transpiration we call evapotranspiration, and the stomates here, the leaf stomates, can regulate water loss to maintain an appropriate water status in the leaves by balancing the atmospheric demand for water with the ability of the vegetation roots to supply water from the soil. So wetlands can have a really high evapotranspiration rate. There are many factors that regulate evapotranspiration in wetlands, and ET is highly variable both seasonally and daily. So evaporation requires 4 conditions: available water, energy to evaporate, and a high vapor pressure gradient, which really means higher humidity at the evaporative surface compared to that in the surrounding air. And lastly, evapotranspiration needs movement or transfer of that water vapor away from the wetland surface by wind. So typically summer usually has higher ET rates because there's more energy, so a lot of more solar radiation. There's a higher air temperature. Typically on those days you have a lower humidity. And then if you have a really windy day, those ET rates can become very high. So measuring ET accurately can be difficult. And a hydrologist can do this a few ways, depending really on how much money we have or what data are available to us locally. So for example, the large tower in the middle of this wetland uses a really expensive instrumentation to directly measure ET, and it's called eddy covariance. But we can also use data collected at meteorological stations and estimate ET with established mathematical equations. Vegetation within a wetland will regulate ET and influence the wetland water table. But interestingly, researchers have found that even vegetation surrounding a wetland can also directly influence the water level of a wetland. So for example, aspen trees in the boreal plain can effectively pull water from a wetland and transfer it upslope through ET processes. So as a result, the uplift of water by aspen becomes a major component of a wetland water budget. So now we're going to start talking about the wetland types in British Columbia. And wetlands are distributed unevenly throughout BC because there's differences in geology and climate and the source of water. So wetlands occur in a widely diverse setting ranging from the coastal margins where tides and river discharge are, the primary sources of water. And then we go to the mountain valleys where wetlands are really only common in the valley bottoms. The estuarine wetlands, where tidal saltwater and inland freshwater meet and mix, are plentiful along the coast. In northern BC, we see a lot of wetlands with peatland soils because of the cooler climate. But in the warmer, drier climate of the southern interior, it would limit peatland development unless it's at higher elevation. So in that case, common wetlands are marshes and swamps. So this is a conceptual diagram that I used to summarize the relationship between hydrologic exchanges and predominant sources of water and common wetland types in BC. So for example, bog peatlands are primarily sourced by precipitation, whereas fen peatlands are primarily groundwater fed. Other wetlands like marshes will have a mix of source waters, while rainfall interception loss by dense shrubs and trees and swamps could result in less direct precipitation. So for this reason, swamps may be more surface water dominant than a marsh. So bogs are shrubby or trees, and they develop in basins where peat accumulation has raised the wetland surface above groundwater flow, or less commonly where groundwater flow is above granite bedrock. So although the peatland water table may be at or near the surface of the peat, the predominant source of water to the bog is precipitation. Fens are peatlands where groundwater inflow is dominant. So these sites are characterized by shrubs and sedges and grasses. Fens develop in basins or lake margins, also in river floodplains. And as I talked about before, in those seepage slopes. So this is where the water table is usually at or just below the peat surface for most of the growing season. A swamp is forested or treed or has tall shrubs, and they have minimal, they can be underlain with well decomposed peat, but it'll be minimal. The sources of water are mixed, and the site usually has a flowing or fluctuating semi-permanent sort of near surface water table. So you'll see these on sort of a flatter floodplain or flatter landscape, or in a depression. A marsh is a shallow flooded mineral wetland dominated by emergent grass-like vegetation. There's usually a fluctuating water table, and the early season high water usually drops throughout the growing season. Exposure of the substrate in the late season or during dry years is common. And I'm sure we've seen some of these dry up this last summer. And the water source to the wetlands depends on the landscape position and geology. So river floodwater is a common surface water source to some marsh wetlands. And the substrate is usually mineral, but it can have some well decomposed organic layer, which is derived from marsh vegetation. I wanted to quickly talk about sort of aquatic wetlands. So they are shallow waters dominated by rooted or submerged plants. These communities are always associated with permanent, still or really slow moving water. So, those shallow potholes or deeper ponds. Shallow water sites are usually permanently flooded. And sometimes they can be exposed during extreme drought years. Estuaries are at the confluence of a freshwater source and the marine environment. and they're affected by occasional or diurnal tidal flooding. So the vegetation is adapted to brackish water and typically has a mix of graminoids and forbs. So these ecosystems have similar characteristics to wetland ecosystems, but there's that addition of the diurnal fluctuations in the water level and the variable salinity. Associated flood sites occur in locations that are flooded for moderate periods, so say around a month of the growing season, and it limits the canopy to tall shrubs like willow and alder. The annual erosion and deposition of sediment generally limit the understory, and higher benches typically only flood during the snowmelt periods, which also limits what trees will grow there. But as we've seen during those really wet years, the highest benches can even be inundated by floodwaters. And so then this vegetation will sort of be consistent with an upland forest on those seepage faces. So wetlands can change over time, and natural processes such as sediments that fill wetlands will affect hydrologic function. And wetlands can also modify their environment as they mature. So peatlands may fill in, or I guess the peat will fill in the depression that it was originally formed to create a peatland. Also, large woody debris can form natural dams that impound shallow wetlands. Beavers can also create dams that form natural wetlands in habitats that are favorable for their needs. And beaver are shown to be distributed across BC. So we can see from this distribution map of the blue and yellow dots, beavers are distributed across. However, we know that beaver trapping and eradication efforts may have reduced the formation of new wetlands. As well, the woody debris may have been reduced with harvesting of riparian vegetation. So in these cases, human-induced changes have likely altered the development of natural wetlands across BC in some areas. Wetlands function in a whole watershed. So changes in hydrologic processes due to land use change upstream of a wetland will affect its hydrologic function. So humans have substantially increased hydrologic disturbances, and these changes can increase sediment production and transport and increase nutrient concentrations and loads. So wetland disturbance includes altered inflows, increased outflows, permanent flooding, or even water extraction. So altered inflows result because of increased stormwater runoff diverted from urban, industrial, or agriculture areas, while drainage ditches, channels or canals, or removal of natural barriers like vegetation or even peatland mining may increase those outflows. Obstructions to surface water exchanges such as roads and railways and culverts alter the natural hydrology, and wetlands have been permanently flooded due to hydroelectric development, or there's water extraction in areas of irrigation or maybe gas development. So these changes in the natural hydrologic function of wetlands can create problems of too much or too little and even too polluted water within the watershed. So what about wetlands and climate change? So climate scientists use climate models to project the range of future warming possibilities based on different emission scenarios. So models refer to these representative concentration pathways, or RCP. And they are different scenarios of how concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will change as a result of human activities. So the RCP pathways range from 2.6, where there is really high effort to curb emissions with, say, renewable energy or capturing emissions. And then it goes to, say, 8.5, where there's really low effort to curb emissions. So we're just moving along as business as usual. And so to note, actually, the RCP 2.6 is the scenario of countries meeting the Paris Agreement goal of keeping within that 2-degree warming compared to pre-industrial time. So that blue line in the graph. And so all 3 emission pathways have a close range of projected warming for the year 2015 in BC. And so given that the majority of our planning is within that time frame, we can start thinking about how we can adapt our policies and practices for around 3 degrees of warming from a 1969 to 1999 historical baseline, and the implications of that temperature change. So here I'm showing plots that compare the historical baseline to the projected air temperature in BC for 2050s. And the climate models are predicting an average warming of 3.2 degrees annually from the historical baseline. So air temperatures are going to get warmer. And similar to the previous plots, these compare the historical baseline to projected precipitation as snow in BC for the 2050s. So climate models are predicting 7% more precipitation annually from a historical baseline, but we can also expect a higher precipitation increase during the winter season, but that precipitation will mostly come as rain, and we will have 30%, estimated 30% less snow. So the altered seasonal precipitation means we could anticipate more and frequent intense precipitation, more rain and less snowpack with an earlier snowmelt. The winter air temperatures and precipitation are likely to become more variable, which may affect groundwater recharge in really unpredictable ways. So rapid snowmelt and rain on frozen ground could increase runoff and decrease groundwater recharge. But rain on unfrozen ground could infiltrate and increase the groundwater levels. As well, the increase in air temperatures means that we can anticipate a longer growing season, higher ET rates, and potentially prolonged summer drought. And so we will be seeing, hotter, drier summers along with wetter winters. And so we really need to shift our expectations of what, a normal season is in BC. The altered hydrology is the greatest anticipated impact to wetlands for climate change. And placing wetlands within the context of hydrologic landscapes, so that is their position with respect to groundwater flow systems at different magnitudes, the relation to other surface water bodies, and climate setting. It's possible to make some qualitative assessment about their vulnerability to climate change. So wetlands dependent on atmospheric exchanges or primarily precipitation will likely be more immediately affected by climate change than wetlands dependent on groundwater sources that will sort of buffer those climate effects. And all wetlands will be vulnerable to climate change, but likely at different time scales if the groundwater flow system is recharged predominantly by snowmelt. So the winter air temperature and precipitation are likely to become more variable, and as I mentioned before, may affect groundwater fed wetlands in more unpredictable ways. Wetlands in mountain landscapes generally form in the narrow flat uplands and in the narrow lowlands between the base of slopes. and the streams. So wetlands in the uplands are almost nearly entirely dependent on precipitation as their water source and would be highly vulnerable to climate change because the area from which the wetland would collect their groundwater and surface water would be almost negligible. So in contrast, the wetlands in the lowlands would receive their water primarily from groundwater inflow and from streams. But wetlands are generally near the headwaters of both streams and groundwater flow systems. And bedrock geology may limit groundwater flow. So given their high topographic position and relatively small watershed areas, wetlands in mountain landscapes are likely moderately to highly vulnerable to climate change. Hummocky glacial landscapes, which are characteristic of the boreal plains regions, have these regional upland and lowland, but then there are these hummocky terrain units superimposed on top. And so wetlands commonly occupy the depressions, but there isn't typically an integrated stream network. So stream flow is generally not a major source of water to the wetlands, and they primarily depend on their interaction with groundwater and precipitation. And there may be these short, infrequent periods of overland runoff from snowmelt or spring rains. So the groundwater flow system in this landscape is really complex. And so there'd be all those different types of wetlands: groundwater recharge, discharge, flow through, perched. And if there are substantial changes in the rain, snow, and runoff patterns, then there will be changes in the hydrologic functions of these wetlands, and it will result in a range of vulnerability to climate change. So those that are dependent on precipitation for their water source will be probably highly vulnerable most immediately. The geology of the landscape will also play a major role as landscapes composed in glacial till deposits with slow groundwater movement will probably be more vulnerable, while those wetlands formed on the glacial sandy outwash will have more groundwater movement and will likely be less vulnerable to climate change. So groundwater is really an important water source to buffer those changes in climate. Wetlands on coastal landscapes receive their water as a combination of groundwater inflow, precipitation, and flooding from streams. So the broad, flat lowlands commonly have slow runoff and shallower water tables. So as a result, they could be moderately vulnerable to climate change because they depend on precipitation and flooding from streams. And this is especially so if they don't receive groundwater inflow from these sort of long, deeper regional groundwater flow systems. So in addition, the change in sea level as a result of climate change would also be one of the biggest threats to this landscape. And lastly, we'll look at river valley. These landscapes are characterized by, those broad lowlands that have the smaller terraces nested between them. They're bounded up by uplands at various extents, and the valley walls may not be as large as mountains. So this more complex landscape results in a variety of wetland types because of the differences in their source waters. So in turn, this will affect their vulnerability to climate change. So generally, regional groundwater flow will move into the valley and will discharge across the valley bottom. And then wetlands will receive water from these regional systems and be buffered from variations in climate. But the surface flooding at higher river stages could cause water to move laterally across the floodplain and fill in some of these depressions. And so the stage of the water in the wetlands follows the river stage, essentially. And so the vulnerability of these wetlands will really be dependent on what's going on upstream of the watershed, because we always have to remember that a wetland exists in a watershed. And so if there's changes to the stream flow, you know, different or a change in pattern with precipitation or reduced contribution to the groundwater that contributes to the stream, or perhaps increased transpiration from valley bottom vegetation, or even the recession of glaciers. All this will influence the stream flow and what happens in a floodplain. So increasing air temperatures and changing hydrologic conditions in the mountainous Kootenay region of BC are expected to affect floodplain wetland extent and function along the Columbia River. And so recent research on the Upper Columbia Wetlands complex by my colleagues used remote sensing to map variations in floodplain open water wetland extent during April to October over time. So from 1984 to 2019. And they found that the seasonal variation in open water extent and duration was similar across the two time periods, but the permanent water body extent diminished by about 16%. So this suggests that there is variability in of individual wetlands to climate change located in these river floodplains. So while some wetlands may persist, others are drying up. So now we want to know why. And to answer that question, we need to understand the hydrologic function of these individual wetlands. So this is where current ongoing research comes in the Upper Columbia Wetlands complex. This is with ourselves, MacHydro, and building on the work conducted by the Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partners and Dr. Suzanne Bailey. And we're working to evaluate wetland vulnerability to climate change, as well as determine priority wetlands where management actions like conservation or mitigation to climate change could be implemented in the most vulnerable of wetlands. So this figure presents 6 wetland hydrographs collected in 2020. And the wetlands function differently depending on their primary source of water and their geomorphic setting. So for example, this wetland in the red has a very similar hydrograph pattern to the river. And so these wetlands would be connected to the main river via surface channels. In contrast, this one in the blue has a different pattern. And this wetland is actually isolated from the main river. It doesn't have any surface channels to the main river, and it's more groundwater dominated. So the recession of the hydrograph is a lot slower because it has a groundwater source. And this wetland actually has beaver dams that are obstructing the surface channels. So like I said before, beavers are very important in the hydrologic function of wetlands. And so we see that there's the threshold where water level has to reach a certain point before water can flood into that wetland. So we're looking at how wetland water levels change and the differences in watershed function. And so we want to continue to assess whether a wetland is more or less vulnerable, depending on whether the wetland is predominantly connected via surface or groundwater flow. So what does this mean for the wetlands in your watershed? Well, every human lives in a watershed, and many of these watersheds have wetlands that support the function of the water cycle. But people are changing the water cycle in their watersheds through land disturbance and climate change. And if wetlands are lost or degraded, then the watersheds will poorly function and we'll have problems around too little, too much, or too polluted of water. And so we must continue to ask these really complex questions like, how do we manage wetlands for these changes? And how can we prepare wetlands to cope? So in this case, we must conserve, enhance, and restore the hydrologic function of wetlands in these watersheds by detecting and understanding changes in the water cycle at various space and time scales in an effort to predict the effects of human-caused hydrologic changes to these wetland ecosystems. Great.
Thank you so much, Amy. It was really great knowing how there's so many different sources that it's not just one size fits all in terms of wetlands. So that's definitely very nice. Yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to open the floor up to our participants. If you do have any questions for Amy or Ryan, feel free to unmute yourself or you can type in the chat as well.
I didn't see any questions in the chat, but there's some great conversations and comments about how aspen copses can pump water uphill and how this can actually potentially affect boreal areas from conifer dominated deciduous dominated trees. Do you want to touch on that a little bit, Amy, on some of your experiences that you've seen in these changing landscapes and how that's affecting the water availability?
Yeah, so you see, especially in the boreal, so if there's harvesting done, so if they are removing some of the aspen vegetation for harvest, you'll see a lot more water available for the wetlands. And so conifers are different in that they don't have that sort of uplift ability. And so they wouldn't contribute as much to a wetland water budget in that regard. But if there is harvested in the vicinity of a wetland within the watershed, it will change sort of those runoff patterns and how much water is available to run off to a watershed or to a wetland, sorry.
Does anybody have any other questions for Amy and Ryan? Oh, there's one from Sonia. She asked, are there simple measures for evaluating the flow to and potential for restoring dry marshes by exposing the water table?
Are there simple measures? That's interesting. I think well, like I said, I mean, every wetland functions within a watershed. And so understanding why that wetland is dry or that marsh is dry in the first place would be a very important first step. And so I think you want to look at both the wetland and the watershed scale. And so I think one of the first steps is to, get out on the landscape. And you can measure some stream flows, or you could, oh, that's a really good question. I think really you need to take a watershed perspective. And then once you can understand the hydrologic processes that dominate that or those individual wetlands, you can start and understand how to restore some of these marshes. As to how to make the water table come back in a marsh, if there's been disturbance, it's an interesting management question, which it's complex, I'll say.
Thank you, Amy. Elsa, should I just go with the questions here, or did you want to?
You can keep going.
Okay.
I was in the chat and I saw that pop up, but you can take over.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a couple more questions here, Amy.
Sure.
From Scott. do you have any input on how invasive plants like phalaris or reed canary grass might change the hydrology of a marsh?
Sorry. Oh, here we go. Do you have any input on how invasive plants like reed grass might change the hydrology? Oh, I don't have specific knowledge on reed grass, unfortunately, but I think as the water level changes, that will really dominate and modify whether or not those reed grasses will grow or not grow. So I think the more important factor is the water table depth rather than the reed grass modifying the water level, if that makes sense.
Sure, thank you, Amy. And then next from Sebastian. Hearing this wonderful representation leads to think that fens are even more important to conserve to mitigate climate-mediated hydrology changes. Is this accurate?
Sorry, I'm just trying to follow the questions as well. Sorry, could you repeat that question? I kind of lost how.
Yeah, for sure. It's from Sebastian Jones.
Sebastian, yeah.
They said, hearing this wonderful presentation leads to think that fens are even more important to conserve to mitigate climate-mediated hydrology changes. Is this accurate?
Yeah, fens are very important for the hydrology of the boreal landscape. And not only just from a hydrologic perspective, but also from carbon storage. And so as you know, peatland's a really interesting soil type. And so if you start to lose wetlands or the wetland or the peatlands start to dry down, you can't store as much carbon. So in that case, it's an important aspect for climate change. And also peatlands are very important for the storage and release of water for some of these watersheds. And so any disturbance to these peatlands will effectively change how things move downstream.
Thank you so much. And next question from Darcy. Do you have any recommendations for wetland construction techniques? For instance, would you recommend surface or groundwater techniques in the face of climate change?
Sorry, could you repeat that one again?
Yeah, for sure. Would you recommend any wetland construction technique in the face of climate change? So for example, would you recommend surface or over groundwater or vice versa?
Maybe Ryan, you could, I mean, my wheelhouse isn't really wetland restoration. So maybe Ryan could step in and talk about some of these techniques.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily a wetland construction expert either, but one of the things it's a really good question relative to like, where does the water come from? And Amy talked about, the water balance and the water budget, and one of the key things for climate change adaptation and mitigation will be redundancy in watersheds. So when we think about redundancy in watersheds, we want a range of hydrologic functions in those watersheds. So, if you look at like a floodplain system, we may have, a mix of surface and groundwater dominated wetlands, as Amy demonstrated in for Columbia. It's that range of wetland types that helps build redundancy into the system. So I would argue that, there's a range of different techniques and a lot of really good experts locally too that build wetlands, and making sure it's sort of a design or a construction technique that helps promote that idea of redundancy and redundancy and resiliency. And with that in mind, you may have a lack of surface water connected wetlands in a particular system where there used to be some, or you may have a lack of groundwater dominated wetlands. And I think it's really a fit for purpose kind of a thing.
I think I could touch on that a little bit more, Ryan. You're completely accurate. So during the Wetlands Institute, that's one of the main factors that we discuss is, restoring these wetlands that have been degraded on the landscape. And what Tom Biebighauser often says, he's the wetland restoration expert that has joined us for the last, I think 15 years for the Institute. And it really is about, like Ryan said, where the water is coming from. You really have to kind of cater to the water that's going to be on the site, but also with our changing landscape and climate change, knowing a little bit about what's going to happen to the water in that area, if it makes sense to create a surface water technique, if you know that the precipitation rates are going to be lower. So it doesn't make sense to build a wetland that relies on precipitation. And then also, if you're in an area, your project site, and you have to dig 8 meters down to get to the groundwater table, it might not be cost effective to create a groundwater wetland. And then other considerations to consider when you are doing wetland restoration is, yes, it is important to build wetlands to mitigate the potential impacts to the watershed due to climate change, but often funders are looking for, how is this going to benefit wildlife? So then you want to build in these techniques that will cater to different habitat needs for whatever target wildlife species. For example, if you're wanting to target amphibians, you might want to build an ephemeral wetland so that we don't have bullfrogs moving in and eating everything, right? So as much as we need to consider change and what's going to happen, we really need to look at what our site looks like, what our funders want, and where the water is going to be in the next decade to 2 decades, so that you're not building a wetland that's going to be obsolete in about 5 years.
Thank you, Ryan and Alyssa. Next, I have a question from Caroline. Do you know of any case studies in BC where beavers have been reintroduced and or beaver analog dams have been built to increase flows in the stream from intermittent to perennial? I'm thinking of coastal streams where wetlands have been lost to agricultural development.
I have a couple of examples. So we just completed, or the Columbia Wetland Stewardship Partners just completed I guess they were acting as beavers up in the Upper Columbia. I've seen this lots in Alberta and in other jurisdictions where they have reintroduced beavers to help on the landscape. Other studies in British Columbia, I'm not too sure, but there is that one that we've just recently completed in the Upper Columbia, building the kind of beaver analog dams, and hopefully they work. The one challenge with beaver dams is they're not temporally stable, so they are meant to blow out, and they do blow out naturally. So that's one of the things that, from a management perspective, needs to be considered is, where do you do these types of activities and how do you want them to function? So they're not necessarily we're going to build a beaver dam here and it's going to fix things forever. It needs to kind of integrate within the system.
Thanks so much. And I think I missed a question from Mark. Is there a preferred wetland type to maximize winter flood control as well as groundwater recharge in the summer?
Preferred wetland type to maximize winter flood control. Well, Amy, what do you think? Is there, like, I don't know if there's a preferred wetland type. What would you think, Amy, to maximize winter flood control? Like wetlands that are maybe more temporally variable in their water levels would help attenuate flows in the winter if you do get kind of larger events. So as Amy demonstrated in the Upper Columbia example, we have some wetlands that pretty much drain every year. Those wetlands that function in that way would be the best for flood control. And they probably have relatively high permeability as well, so probably good for recharge as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much. I don't see any more questions unless I missed anything, Alyssa. No. Just leave a couple of minutes if anyone has any more questions. Otherwise, yeah, Alyssa, do you have anything Alice, did you want to send an evaluation form? Is it after or?
Yes, I can do that. Thank you for the reminder. I'm going to put the evaluation form in the chat. Oh, there might be one more question. Oh, just a comment. So this evaluation form, as I mentioned, will take you about 5 minutes. It's really, really helpful to highlight to our funders that these types of events are needed, and then the success of the funding that we've already established for these types of events. So if everyone could take a quick 5 minutes to fill in that evaluation, and then your name will be get entered to receive a BCWF swag bag prize.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, if there are any questions later on, we can help relay, and we will be reaching out to everyone who registered to the event for a copy recording and the links that we have mentioned here as well. So yeah, thank you again, Amy, and thank you again, Ryan, for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
Great. And yeah, well, hopefully we can stay in touch, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.